Now, uh, now I want to talk now in this module about Unga and Shukpiak cultures, or what you may be more used to hearing called Aleut and Aleutic culture, although that has definitely started to change over time. As we talk about these groups, we are talking about really two distinct languages, two distinct culture groups, but that we often kind of consider together, partly because they have really closely related languages, but they extend over these communities that comprise these two groups, extended historically over about 1,600 miles as an airplane would fly from Atu here all the way over to Prince William Sound, so kind of the edge of Shukpiak territory. So to give you some geographic context, because I know as Alaskans, sometimes we're used to insanely large distances, but just to give this some context, especially perhaps if we have a few non-Alaskans listening to this video, the distance across the Aleutian Islands and then through Aleutic or Shukpiak traditional homelands is roughly equivalent to, and in fact more than, the distance from San Diego, California into the Canadian city of Vancouver, British Columbia. So just an incredibly large distance that we're talking about. But as you think about that environment, I want you to look at that and say kind of, what do you notice about the environment? And what you probably notice, among other things, is that this is very much a marine kind of environment that people are living in. This is traditionally coastal areas and islands. And then I want you to think in your brain and maybe write a few words down on a paper of what kinds of things you might predict about these two cultures based on their environment. And then at the end of the lecture, I want you to think about how much of what you wrote was true in your predictions and how much either wasn't true, or at least it was stuff that you couldn't have predicted just based on the environment. Because we're kind of see something as we go through talking about these different cultures. On the one hand, indigenous communities of Alaska have been historically and are to this day profoundly shaped by the environment, right? You cannot understand Inupiat culture outside of the far northern tundra. You cannot understand Tlingit society outside of the rich coastal rainforests of traditional Tlingit homelands. So environment is huge in influencing people's cultures. And at the same time, a culture is not reducible to its environment. A culture is not just sort of the place it developed in, right? If it were, then, you know, groups that are like right next door to each other, like Germany and France, would be identical, right? And that's obviously not the case. And so we'll see that there are also aspects of cultures that have to do with all sorts of other things other than where people live. But anyways, that's something to think about as we talk. But I want to talk first about the group of people traditionally who have been referred to as Aleut, but which that is what we would call an exonym, or a name that comes from a group other than their own name, or sorry, a name that comes from outside the group. But we are going to be referring to them as Unangan or Unanga, which is how you pronounce this word, by the way. The X is, shall we say, mostly silent, is the best way to explain that to an English speaker. So Unanga or Unangan. Now, when we talk of this group of people, among other things, we are talking about the group of people who provided us with the very name of Alaska, right? So Alaska comes from, as this little infographic demonstrates, comes from Alashkak. Forgive me, I do not speak Unangan. That is my best pronunciation, but it translates, as I've heard it explained, basically like the ocean moves towards the shore, or as they're translating it here in this, the object towards which the action of the sea is directed, which to me seems a little bit overly wordy for what's being connoted, but basically like the ocean moving towards the shore. So that's like Alaska, right? So the very name of our state, for that matter, the very flag of our state is from Benny Benson, a 14-year-old Alaska native boy who designed the flag as part of a competition, whose mother is, or was, I should say, Unangan. And we are talking about the group of people also who were the very first, or one of the very first, I should say, Alaska Native groups to encounter Russians and of course, an area that was heavily impacted by Russian fur trading very early on, really that first wave of Russian fur traders. And we're also talking about a group of people that traditionally was sort of treated as one of the three pillars of Alaska native cultures in Alaska. So if you look at like the flag of or logo of the Alaska Federation of Natives, which was a group that was pivotal in establishing ANCSA and still exists to this day, even though several groups have withdrawn, a few groups have withdrawn recently. Anyways, AFN, very important group, but their traditional logo had Indian, by which meaning Athabascan and Southeast coastal groups, Eskimo, quote unquote, meaning Yupik and Nupiaq, and then Aleut as sort of the third ring there. So when we talk about Unangax culture, then we are talking about a group which in many ways has pivotally shaped sort of how we even think about Alaska and was sort of the beginning of, in many ways, what we think of Alaska as a state today. So I want you to think about that, and I want you to realize how important it is to learn about Unangax culture for those reasons. But I think it's also critical to learn about Unangax culture because of reasons that have nothing to do with our present day state, but just to do with a traditional culture that goes back thousands upon thousands of years of people who found a rich life within the difficult to live in Aleutian Islands within the quote Bering Sea, named after Vitus Bering, the Russian explorer, but who made a living here and make a living here. And I think, as with any culture we talk about, have profound things to teach us about what it means to be a human being. So with that in mind, by the way, if you're wondering, as a quick aside, if you're wondering where the term, why this group of people came to be called Aleut, if they're named for themselves in their own cultures, Unangan, which is basically like cliffside dweller, but then why did they come to become called Aleut? We're not entirely sure. There's a few different theories, but one of them is that there's the Chukchi group, which are basically native people of Siberia, of far eastern Siberia, who is probably how Russians learned about native people further east than Siberia was from Siberian people. So they were probably in contact, right, with Aleut people, and they had a term Aleut or Aliot, it's like island. So it's possible that that's how the term Aleut enters Russian, and then that becomes the term that's applied to people. But in any case, let's talk a little bit about Unangax culture traditionally. A few things to note. One of the things to note, several of people have brought up in their assignment ones that they're interested in learning sort of the quote, like the origins or where Alaska Native people came from. And I think we mean multiple things by that. I think some people mean like, where do the present day tribes come from? And we're covering that a lot. I think some people mean more like archaeologically, how did people first enter into Alaska? And of course, as I've alluded to in an earlier lecture, that's a really complex topic, right? Because people have their own stories of where they came from. And for me, just how I view anthropology and as a cultural anthropologist, to me, it's incredibly important that we honor people's own narratives of where they came from. But some tribes very much consider archaeology to be an important part of telling their story, and archaeologists, of course, kind of have their own way of telling these types of stories. So I will kind of cover the archaeological side while also acknowledging that there are a variety of stories to this. According to archaeologists, though, people have been present in the Aleutians for at least 9,000 years. That's about how far back actual sites go, by which I mean sites that we have found evidence of human beings, tools, different things like that. And we've been able to use dating methods, whether that's radiocarbon dating or stratigraphy or other things, like basically how far deep in the ground it is, to determine how long people have been here. So people in the Aleutians, at least back to 9,000, although as this whole big unknown chunk says, it's not saying unknown as in people weren't there. What that's saying is people probably were there. We just don't have archaeological sites for them. But people's genetics in these areas, how complex their languages are and different from other groups, and just also the fact that there was land to be settled and people tend to spread into land, and that there was people in other places nearby, like other parts of Alaska, strongly suggest there have been people there back to like 15,000, 16,000 years ago. So for thousands upon thousands and upon thousands of years, predating many of the cultures that we spend so much time learning about in our history classes in high school. By the way, this chart is from Alaska State Office of History and Archaeology. This is from National Geographic. To oversimplify a rather complex topic, anthropologists for a very long time were of the majority view that indigenous peoples came from Northeast Asia by route of a land bridge, where basically during a major ice age period, the water was bound up in glaciers that covered much of North America. And as a result, if you have less water because it's bound up in glaciers on the land, that means that ocean water goes down, which takes a second to get your mind around. But if you bound up the water in glaciers that are over on the land, that means there's less water in the ocean, water drops, and you would have had like a land bridge, as they say, right? A way of getting from what we now think of as Russia to what we now think of as Alaska. That was the dominant theory for a very long time. And that still is more or less the dominant theory, but a few things have caused us to have to modify that. Among them, there was the idea for a very long time that what had happened was that the glaciers then had this like corridor, what we call the ice-free corridor theory, that people could get through and then start to populate what we call the lower 48 and lower down. And that worked for a time when we had like Clovis sites and other kinds of sites that went back a certain number of thousands of years. But then we started to get sites that were older and older. And at first, there was a tendency to kind of poo-poo them and be like, oh, is that an actual accurate site? But eventually we were getting things like a site in Chile that goes back like 14,000 years. And so again, to overcomplicate or to oversimplify a very complex issue, basically many archaeologists and geologists are of the opinion that there would not have been a corridor available to move through. So you would have had a huge chunk of glacier in the way of anybody moving during the time period where allegedly people came from East Asia and got all the way down to places like Chile, or even places like the Meadowcroft site. And so instead, a theory that's gained ground, bit of an ironic wording, a theory that's gained ground is like the island standstill, basically the idea that, or the coastal refugia theory, but the idea that people would have moved along from East Asia, would have moved along in boats and other crafts along the coast and then down into the lower 48, thereby sidestepping this big glacier. If they did so, that would obviously be really interesting, among other things, because it would suggest that people, it might suggest that the Bering Strait in general, right, and including the Aleutian Islands, may have been part of the route by which people originally came into the Americas, making the Aleutian Islands one of the first places in the Americas to receive people. Although many archaeologists, based on the dating of the sites, think perhaps instead first into here, then over to here. But yeah, it's very possible, and I consider it probable that that would have been one of the first areas to receive human beings, was the Aleutian Islands. So pretty fascinating stuff. Humans have been in however you choose to tell the story, archaeology, traditional or oral storytelling, people have been in the Aleutian Islands for thousands upon thousands of years. And the amount of people that have been here is very, very large. So the Aleutian Islands traditionally, obviously there's nobody like walking around with a notebook taking a census. However, what has been estimated, I've heard estimates as low as 10,000 or 8 to 10,000 and as high as 25,000. And a lot of estimates kind of circle around the 15,000 to 20,000 people in the Aleutian Islands immediately prior to Russians arriving in the area. After Russians arrived in the area, sadly, the population in many communities declined pretty considerably, particularly in Alutiiq or Shukpiaq communities, but also in some of the Aleutian Island communities, including some villages that essentially kind of disappeared. People stopped inhabiting. And there was a variety of reasons for that. Some of it was out and out violent conflict. A lot of it was infectious disease that people weren't used to from a group of people very different than their own. Which is a hard thing to talk about and to acknowledge, but is part of that history. But before all of that, population sizes may have been as high as 20 to 30,000, or at least in the like high, right around 10,000. That estimate, I think, has been arrived at in different ways. I was speaking to one archaeologist about this, who I'm not sure if she's on record or not about this, so I don't want to not cite her because I don't want to not give her credit for her work, but I also don't want to cite her if this is something that she hasn't published on and does not want to be her official on the record opinion. But anyways, I was speaking to pretty well-known archaeologist of the Aleutian Islands, and she was expressing that part of the way we come at these estimates, or at least that she has when she's been trying to figure out what the population probably was, is by basing it off of the amount of sea lions that are in that area. And the reason why the number of sea lions is because for the kayaks, you need to have sea lion skins that would have been put around that traditionally been put around the kayaks to keep them water repellent. And you basically need like 2 sea lions to make enough sea lion skin for like one person's kayak, or igyash, but they're kayak as we would say in English. And then those break down every few years. And so if you kind of do the math on it, you can figure out, oh, well, you basically need to be continually replenishing the amount of sea lions, and you need like 2 sea lions every year or 2 to put over the kayak. And then that tells you, based on the amount of sea lions, that's a way you can kind of extrapolate basically what we would call like the maximum population or carrying capacity, like how many human beings could live in this area based on that, which that whole line of thinking tells us a number of things. One, we have to sometimes get really creative to try to figure out what was going on in an area 10,000 years ago. But number 2, or even 2,000 years ago. But number 2, it tells us how incredibly important sea lions were traditionally in this culture, right? Sea lions were very much life in the fact that to have kayaks that would allow you to procure a lot of the like food that would have been deeper into the ocean, you needed those sea lions to help keep your kayaks really, really, really waterproof. And so just how critically important sea lions were, as Larry Merkuliev touches upon in his video. Which, by the way, speaking of the Larry Merkuliev video, I hope you found that video really interesting, and I want to pause the video now and then we'll talk a bit about that video.